Welcome back, everyone. Today's story is one you simply cannot miss. It's a profound journey of faith, challenge, and transformation. What if everything you believed about your faith was challenged by an encounter with Jesus himself? Imagine standing before the one you've devoted your life to, only to realize you've misunderstood something crucial. That's exactly what happened to Father Jonathan, a devoted priest from Wolverton, North Dakota. After suffering a sudden cardiac arrest, Father Jonathan experienced a near-death experience that brought him face-to-face with the Savior he had preached about for decades. But what Jesus revealed to him wasn't just life-changing, it completely redefined his understanding of faith and religion. In today's video, we'll explore how Father Jonathan's profound experience turned his world upside down and forced him to confront a truth he never expected. From a near-death encounter to life-altering revelations, this is a journey of humility, redemption, and the discovery of what truly matters in faith. Stick around to hear every detail of his extraordinary story. You won't believe what happens. If you're excited to dive into Father Jonathan's incredible journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and drop a comment below to let us know where you're tuning in from. Let's get started. I've been a priest in Wolverton, North Dakota for over 30 years, and for most of my life, I thought I had a solid grasp on what it meant to follow Christ. My days were structured around prayer, study, and shepherding my congregation. I lived with the belief that I knew the answers, the way to salvation, the nature of sin, and the boundaries of God's grace. But everything I thought I knew changed one fateful Sunday afternoon. That morning had been like any other. I had preached a sermon about steadfast faith, shaking hands with the congregation as they left the church. By lunchtime, I was back in the rectory, sitting down to prepare next week's readings. That's when it started, a dull ache in my chest. At first, I chalked it up to stress or fatigue. I ignored it, telling myself it was nothing, but the pain grew sharper, spreading down my arms and up into my jaw. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, and suddenly, I couldn't breathe. I stumbled toward the phone, but before I could dial for help, everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was no longer in my body. At least, that's how it felt. I wasn't in pain anymore, but I was somewhere else, somewhere indescribable. It wasn't a place in the way we think of places. It was as if I was surrounded by light, though the light didn't come from a sun or any source I could pinpoint. It just was. And in that light, I felt peace. An overwhelming peace that erased all fear, all doubt. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced, even in my most profound moments of prayer. Then I saw him. Jesus stood before me. I didn't need an introduction. I knew instantly who he was. His presence radiated a love so pure, so vast that I fell to my knees without hesitation, or at least I would have had I been in a body. It's hard to explain, but in that moment, it felt as though everything I was, my soul, my being, bowed before him. "Jonathan," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "you've done much in my name, and I am pleased with your devotion. But there is something you've misunderstood about me." I was stunned. Misunderstood? I'd spent my life studying Scripture, preaching his word, and guiding others to him. How could I have misunderstood anything? "My love," he continued, "is greater than you've taught. My grace extends farther than you've allowed yourself to believe. Salvation is not as narrow as you've made it seem." His words hit me like a thunderclap. I had always believed in a structured path to salvation, faith through Christ, obedience to Scripture, and adherence to the traditions of the church. But now, here was Christ himself telling me that I had missed the fullness of his love. "Jonathan," he said again, softer this time, "I need you to share this truth with others. Show them how boundless my love is, how wide my arms are open. It won't be easy, but you must." I wanted to argue, to explain how difficult this would be, but before I could speak, he placed his hand on my shoulder, and suddenly every doubt, every fear melted away. All that remained was peace and an unshakable certainty that I had to obey him. And then, just as quickly as it began, it was over. I woke up in a hospital bed, surrounded by the steady beeping of machines. A nurse noticed I was awake and hurried over. "Father, welcome back," she said with a smile. "You've been through quite an ordeal." I learned later that my heart had stopped for 6 minutes. 6 minutes during which doctors and paramedics fought to revive me. Yet those 6 minutes felt like an eternity in the presence of Christ. For days after my discharge, I wrestled with what had happened. Was it real? Was it a dream brought on by lack of oxygen? But no matter how many times I tried to dismiss it, I couldn't shake the memory of his words, the sound of his voice, and the undeniable truth he had revealed. I began to question everything I had ever taught, every sermon I had delivered. Had I been limiting God's love? Had I confined his grace to the walls of my church, to the lines of my theology? The thought terrified me, but it also ignited a fire within me. Jesus had given me a mission, and I couldn't ignore it. No matter how uncomfortable or challenging it would be, I had to tell others what I had seen, what I now knew to be true. When I returned to Wolverton after my discharge from the hospital, I felt like a stranger in my own life. The familiar sights, the church, the rectory, the small-town streets felt unchanged, but I was different. The memory of my encounter with Jesus lingered in my mind, as vivid as if it had just happened. I couldn't ignore it. For days I avoided people. I kept telling myself I needed time to recover physically, but the truth was, I wasn't ready to face anyone. How could I, when my understanding of everything I'd been preaching for decades had been shaken to its core? I spent hours in prayer, kneeling in the quiet sanctuary of the church, hoping for clarity. Lord, I prayed aloud, I don't know how to do this. How do I tell people that what I taught them might not be enough, that I too am learning? But all I could feel was the overwhelming sense of his love and the undeniable weight of his command. Teach them the truth. My first real test came the following Sunday. I stood at the pulpit, looking out at faces I'd come to know so well. Families I had baptized, married, comforted in times of loss. They trusted me. For years I had been their guide, the person they turned to for spiritual answers. But now I felt as though I was fumbling in the dark, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. I gave a sermon that morning, but it was unlike any I'd ever delivered. My words were hesitant, uncertain. I didn't share the full story of my encounter. How could I? Instead, I spoke vaguely about the expansiveness of God's love, urging the congregation to consider how his grace might extend beyond what we understand. Afterward, a few people came up to thank me, as they always did, but I noticed something different in their eyes. There was curiosity, even concern, and I couldn't blame them. My words that morning had been cautious, restrained. I was testing the waters, unsure of how they would respond. That evening, I received a visit from Margaret, one of the most devout members of the parish. She'd been attending services long before I arrived in Wolverton, and she had always been a pillar of the church. "Father Jonathan," she began, her voice gentle but probing, "you spoke differently today. It wasn't like you. Is everything all right?" Her question caught me off guard. Part of me wanted to brush it off, to assure her everything was fine, but another part, the part that had knelt before Jesus and heard his command, knew I couldn't hide forever. "Margaret," I said, choosing my words carefully, "something happened to me during the time I was in the hospital. Something that has made me see things differently." She listened intently as I shared a glimpse of my experience. Not the full depth of my encounter with Jesus, but enough to convey that I had been profoundly changed. To my surprise, she didn't react with skepticism or alarm. Instead, she leaned forward and said, "Father, I think you've been given a gift. Maybe God wants you to lead us in a new way." Her words gave me a glimmer of hope, but they also deepened my sense of responsibility. This wasn't going to be easy. In the weeks that followed, I tried to find the balance between honoring the truths Jesus had revealed to me and staying faithful to the teachings I had upheld for so long. But it wasn't just about my sermons or theological debates. It was about my own inner struggle. One night, I found myself sitting alone in the rectory, staring at my Bible. I had read it cover to cover countless times, but now it felt like a new book entirely. Every passage about God's love, every story of Jesus' compassion, seemed to leap off the page, urging me to see them in a new light. I thought about all the people I had guided over the years, those who had walked through the doors of the church seeking comfort, answers, salvation. Had I given them the full picture of God's grace, or had I unwittingly placed limits on his boundless love? The doubt gnawed at me, but so did the memory of his voice. Teach them. My journey wasn't just about sharing this new understanding. It was about unlearning some of my old beliefs. I had to confront my own pride, my own tendency to think that I had all the answers. It was humbling, and at times it was excruciating. But through it all, I felt his presence. In the quiet moments of prayer and the flicker of candlelight on the altar, I was reminded of his love, a love so vast, so infinite, that no human mind could fully comprehend it. Of course, not everyone was receptive to the changes they began to notice in me. A few parishioners expressed confusion, even frustration at my sermons. One man, a longtime member of the congregation, pulled me aside after Mass one day and said, "Father, I don't know what's going on with you, but you're starting to sound different. Are you sure you're not losing your way?" His words stung, but I reminded myself that this was part of the journey. Jesus hadn't promised it would be easy. He had only promised that he would be with me. And so I continued, one step at a time, trusting that he would guide me, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. It happened during a quiet evening in the rectory, not long after a particularly challenging day. A parishioner had confronted me earlier, questioning why I seemed to be veering from the traditional teachings of the church. "Father Jonathan," he'd said, "you've always been a rock for this parish, but lately it feels like you're questioning the foundation." He wasn't wrong. I was questioning the foundation, my own foundation. After he left, I felt the weight of my doubts pressing down on me. The words of Jesus during my near-death experience echoed in my mind. "My love is greater than you've taught. My grace extends farther than you've allowed yourself to believe." That evening, I knelt in prayer in the small chapel adjoining the rectory. The room was dim, lit only by the flicker of a single candle on the altar. "Lord," I prayed, "I don't understand. I want to be faithful to you, but I feel lost. Show me what you want me to see. Teach me how to follow you." I remained there silent, letting the stillness envelop me. And then it happened. It began as a sensation, an overwhelming warmth that filled the room, as if the air itself was alive with energy. I opened my eyes and saw what I can only describe as a vision. Before me, the walls of the chapel seemed to dissolve, replaced by a vast expanse of light. In that light, I saw people, countless people, stretching as far as the eye could see. They came from every background, every walk of life. There were men and women, children and elders, people of every race and culture. Some were dressed in garments I recognized, others in attire I couldn't place. And then I realized something. These people weren't all Christians. Among them, I saw individuals who clearly followed other faiths: Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, people wearing symbols and clothing tied to traditions I had never studied. Yet they were all there in the presence of this radiant divine light. I was struck by the profound joy on their faces. They weren't just standing there. They were basking in the light, embracing it as if it were the very source of their being. And then I heard his voice again, clear and unmistakable. "Jonathan, do you see? My love is for all." Tears streamed down my face as I tried to process what I was witnessing. All my life I had believed that salvation was exclusive to those who accepted Jesus Christ in the way I had preached. Yet here was Jesus himself, showing me a truth that was far more expansive, far more inclusive than I had ever imagined. "But Lord," I whispered, my voice trembling, "what does this mean? How can this be? What about the teachings of the church?" His response wasn't in words, but in a flood of understanding that poured into me like a rushing river. It was as if he was saying, "The truth of my love cannot be confined by human limitations. It is greater than your doctrines, greater than your divisions. Trust in me, and you will see." When the vision faded, I found myself back in the chapel, the single candle still flickering on the altar. I was overwhelmed, shaken to my core. For a long time, I simply sat there, my head in my hands, trying to comprehend what I had seen. The next day, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. But how could I explain something so profound, so counter to what I had always believed? I decided to share a part of the experience with Margaret. She had been a source of quiet encouragement ever since I first confided in her about my near-death encounter. I invited her to the rectory and over tea described the vision as best as I could. To my surprise, she didn't react with shock or disbelief. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes filled with wonder. "Father Jonathan," she said softly, I think you've been given a glimpse of something we can't fully understand on this side of eternity. Maybe God is asking you to help us see him in a new way." Her words gave me courage, but they also deepened the conflict within me. I knew that sharing this revelation with the wider parish would not be easy. Some would embrace it, others would reject it outright. And yet, I couldn't remain silent. Over the following weeks, I began weaving the lessons of the vision into my sermons. I spoke of God's love as boundless, his grace as limitless. I encouraged the congregation to look beyond their preconceptions, to see Christ not as a gatekeeper, but as the ultimate embodiment of love and acceptance. The reactions were mixed. Some parishioners nodded thoughtfully, while others looked uneasy. A few approached me afterward, expressing confusion or even concern. "Are you saying that everyone is saved, Father?" one man asked pointedly. I didn't have an easy answer for him. "What I'm saying," I replied, "is that God's love is far greater than we can comprehend. And perhaps it's not our place to draw the lines of who's in and who's out." As the weeks passed, the ripple effects of my changed perspective began to spread throughout the parish. I could see the unease in the eyes of some of the older members, those who had long been the gatekeepers of tradition. And then there were others, like Margaret, who seemed to embrace the change wholeheartedly. It wasn't just the sermons that were causing tension, it was everything. The way I spoke now was different. There was a gentleness in my voice that hadn't been there before, a deep, unwavering compassion that I'd never fully expressed. And the way I interacted with the congregation was changing too. No longer was I the priest who stood apart, the authority figure who dispensed wisdom from the pulpit. I was now someone who shared in their struggles, someone who understood that the path to God wasn't always clear or easy. The first real confrontation came during a meeting with the church council. It was a group I had always trusted, but now I felt the weight of their scrutiny. The council had heard rumors of my sermons and the way I was preaching. There was concern, and it was beginning to show. "Father Jonathan," began Mr. Harper, a longtime member and head of the council, "I've heard some troubling things. You've been speaking in ways that don't align with our doctrine. We're all for spiritual growth, but we also believe in the importance of holding to the truths of the church. Are you saying that we've misunderstood the teachings of Jesus all this time?" His words stung more than I expected, and I took a deep breath before responding. "Mr. Harper, I'm not saying that our teachings are wrong, but I'm asking us to look deeper. Jesus came to show us that God's love is for everyone, not just those who fit a specific mold. I've seen something that can't be ignored." "You've seen something?" Mrs. Wells, another member, asked with skepticism. "Father, this sounds like you're losing your faith. Are you questioning the very foundation of what we've always believed?" Their voices were laced with concern, but there was something else, something more urgent. I realized that they were afraid that what I was proposing would change everything. They were holding on tightly to a version of faith that, for them, felt safe, concrete. The truth I had encountered threatened to dismantle it all, but I couldn't back down. I had experienced the undeniable love of Christ in a way that shattered my former understanding of salvation. This wasn't a theological debate, it was the foundation of my being. "I'm not losing my faith," I said quietly but firmly. "I'm finding it. The truth I've learned doesn't negate our history, but it does invite us to understand God in a more expansive way, a way that includes everyone." There was silence in the room, the kind of silence that presses in on you from every angle. The members of the council exchanged uneasy glances, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how they would respond. Finally, Mr. Harper spoke again. "We'll need to discuss this further, Father. We can't just change the way we've been teaching without a thorough understanding of what you're proposing." I nodded. "I understand, but I ask that you open your hearts to the possibility that what I've seen is true. God's love is greater than we can fully comprehend. We cannot limit it." The meeting ended without resolution, but I knew that the conversation wasn't over. What I was asking wasn't just a change of perspective. It was a fundamental shift in how we understood salvation, in how we viewed God's relationship with the world. In the days that followed, I continued to meet with individuals in the parish, sharing my experience with them on a more personal level. Some listened quietly, as though they were afraid to speak their thoughts aloud. Others, like Margaret, welcomed the opportunity to talk about it openly. But there were others who seemed resistant, even hostile. One afternoon, I received a letter from a parishioner, Mr. Thompson, who had been a regular member of the church for years. His letter was filled with criticism, calling my beliefs heresy and blasphemy. He accused me of leading the congregation astray and said that he would no longer be attending Mass under my leadership. The rejection stung. I had always prided myself on being a leader who could guide others, and now it felt as though I was losing the very people I had hoped to inspire. It made me question whether I was doing the right thing. Was I truly hearing God's voice, or was I simply being swept up in my own emotions, lost in the vastness of what I had seen? That night I prayed again, more desperately than ever. "Lord," I whispered, "am I doing the right thing? Have I misunderstood your call? I'm trying to follow you, but I don't know if I can bear the weight of this." I sat in silence, waiting for an answer, and then in that stillness I felt a peace wash over me, a peace that confirmed I was on the right path. It wasn't the peace of certainty, but the peace of trust. "Trust me," he seemed to say. "This is the way I have shown you. Keep walking forward." And so I did. Even though the road ahead was uncertain and the challenges grew heavier with each passing day, I knew that I couldn't turn back. The truth I had been given, though difficult and painful to bear, was not one I could deny. As my teachings began to shift, so did the landscape of my relationships. I had never imagined that my faith would put such a strain on the connections I had spent years building. The greatest source of tension was within my own home. Margaret, who had been supportive from the beginning, found herself caught between her loyalty to me and the mounting pressure from the church community. Her devotion to the parish was unwavering, but as my revelations continued to unfold, she began to question whether she could stand beside me without causing irreparable damage to her own sense of belonging. One evening, after a particularly difficult conversation with a longtime parishioner, Margaret sat down beside me, her face drawn with concern. "Jonathan," she said softly, "I'm starting to worry about you. You're losing so many people. Some are calling you a heretic, others are simply walking away. You're going to have to make a decision soon, whether to keep pushing this new message or whether you'll turn back to what we've always known." Her words cut deeper than I expected. The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and for a moment I questioned whether I was losing touch with reality. Could my vision have been wrong? Was I really doing what God had asked of me? "I can't go back, Margaret," I replied, my voice quiet but resolute. "I can't deny what I've seen, what I've felt. God's love is far bigger than I ever imagined, and I believe He's calling me to share that." Margaret didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us. Finally, she spoke again. "I understand, Jonathan, but I'm afraid for you, and for us." Her words stung, but they were the truth. She wasn't just afraid for me, she was afraid for us, for our marriage, for our lives together. If I was going to continue on this path, I wasn't sure what our future would look like. Would we be able to navigate this journey together, or would it drive us apart? The pressure didn't just come from home. It started to seep into my every interaction. As I walked through the town of Wolverton, I could feel the eyes of my parishioners on me. Some would avoid eye contact altogether, while others would whisper behind my back. The tension was palpable, and it seemed like everyone had an opinion about my newfound beliefs. The most difficult moments came during Mass. I had always seen the congregation as a community of like-minded believers, but now it felt like I was preaching to a divided crowd. I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken questions and doubts that lingered. Some people came to church to hear the old message, the message of salvation that had been passed down for generations. And then there were those who were drawn to my new teachings, who felt the same stirring in their hearts that I had. One Sunday after Mass, a group of older parishioners approached me. They were respectful but firm. "Father Jonathan," one of them said, "we can't accept these new ideas. They're too radical. You've strayed too far from the Word. You're leading people astray." "I'm not leading anyone astray," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. I'm simply pointing to a love that is far greater than we've been taught. I'm showing that God's grace is all-encompassing. You're twisting the word, another parishioner added. You're making God's message fit your own ideas. This isn't the way we've been taught, and it isn't the way we should be following. I stood there, surrounded by these individuals who had once considered me a trusted shepherd, and I felt the weight of their disapproval. I had spent so many years serving them, leading them in prayer, guiding them in their faith, and now, in the blink of an eye, I was the one being cast aside. But even as the pain of rejection cut deep, I couldn't bring myself to renounce what I had seen. The truth that had been revealed to me was undeniable, and though it felt like I was being torn apart, I knew I had to stay true to it. The days grew heavier, and the emotional toll began to manifest in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself wrestling with feelings of loneliness, even when surrounded by people. It was as though the very nature of my existence had shifted, and I no longer knew where I fit. I wasn't the priest I had been. I wasn't the same man I had been before my near-death experience. And I wasn't sure what role I could play in a church that no longer seemed to understand me. Margaret continued to stand by my side, but even she seemed unsure of what the future held. We had become distant, not in a way that suggested a lack of love, but in the way that a storm creates distance between two people standing in the same room. We were both in the storm, struggling to understand what the new world we were living in would look like. I began to question whether my revelations had come too soon. Had I been too hasty in sharing them? Had I misunderstood the message I had been given? But the answer always came back the same: no. Even as the emotional weight grew heavier, I knew that the path ahead, though difficult, was the one I had to walk. As the months passed, the emotional weight of my choices became almost unbearable. I found myself retreating more and more into myself, seeking solace in solitude as I tried to understand my purpose and the spiritual path I had been called to walk. But the more I tried to quiet my thoughts, the more the doubts and fears began to surface. I had embraced a truth that seemed to alienate me from everyone I had ever known. Even Margaret, despite her unwavering support, had moments when I saw the fear in her eyes. Fear for our future, fear for our family, and a deep, aching fear that perhaps I had misled us both. I could feel the shift in the community, too. Mass attendance dwindled, and whispers filled the halls of the church. People I had once considered friends began avoiding me. Conversations that had once been filled with warmth and fellowship now felt strained and awkward. I felt the distance between us growing wider, a chasm that I wasn't sure how to bridge. I began to doubt myself, not the truth I had been shown, not the experience itself, but the way I had approached sharing it. Perhaps I was too forceful in my sermons. Maybe I had pushed too hard, too fast, expecting others to accept a truth they weren't ready to hear. One evening, I sat in my study, staring at the Bible in front of me. The pages felt different now. They no longer held the same comfort they once had. I opened to the Gospel of John, the passage where Jesus speaks of truth setting us free. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 8:32. I had believed in this verse for so long, but now it seemed like a distant promise. I felt more imprisoned than free, trapped by the consequences of my own revelations. Was this truly the truth, or was I simply walking down a path that would ultimately isolate me from everyone I had ever loved? I needed answers, and I needed them fast. The weight of my decisions pressed down on me, and I knew I couldn't continue like this. I needed to seek guidance from someone, anyone who might understand what I was going through. That's when I thought of Father Thomas, an old friend from seminary. He had always been someone I admired for his deep wisdom and calm demeanor, someone who had weathered many storms in his own ministry. I reached out to him, and to my relief, he agreed to meet with me. We sat together in his small office, the shelves lined with books on theology and scripture. There was a warmth in the room, but I could feel the tension in my chest as I prepared to share my struggles. "Jonathan," Father Thomas said, his voice steady and kind, "I can see that something is weighing heavily on you. Tell me what's going on." I took a deep breath, gathering the courage to speak. "I don't know what to do anymore, Thomas. I've experienced something that's shaken me to the core. But the more I share it, the more I feel like I'm losing everyone around me. People I've known my entire life are turning their backs on me. I'm not sure where I belong anymore. Father Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I can understand why you're struggling, he said softly. It's one thing to experience a spiritual awakening, but it's another to navigate the fallout from it. People don't like change, especially when it challenges their deeply held beliefs. I nodded, my throat tightening as I continued. I thought I was called to share this truth, but now I'm not so sure. Am I doing the right thing? Am I leading people astray? Father Thomas took a long pause before responding. Jonathan, I've seen you grow in ways that few others have, and I can tell that you're sincere in your desire to serve God. But sometimes, the path we're called to take is not the easiest one, and it's not always understood by those around us. His words were comforting, but they also left me with more questions. What if I was wrong? What if I was misinterpreting what had happened to me? I don't want to lose everything, I whispered. I don't want to lose my faith, my family, my congregation, but I can't deny what I've experienced. Father Thomas looked at me with a mixture of compassion and wisdom. You don't have to lose everything, Jonathan, but you do need to find a way to hold on to your truth while also loving the people around you. The truth you've been given is powerful, but it's also a gift that needs to be shared with gentleness, patience, and love. I left that meeting with a sense of peace, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. Father Thomas had reminded me that my calling wasn't just to share the truth, but to do so with compassion and understanding. That evening, I went home and sat down with Margaret. I could see the wariness in her eyes, the toll that the past months had taken on her. We talked for hours, sharing our fears, our doubts, and our hopes for the future. I don't want to lose you, Margaret, I said quietly. I don't want to lose our family. I just don't know how to navigate this anymore. She reached out and took my hand. Jonathan, I love you, and I want you to follow the truth you've found, but we have to find a way to do it together. I don't want to be left behind. We both knew that our journey was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, and there would be more challenges, more sacrifices to be made. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of hope. Maybe this was the way forward, finding a balance between the truth I had been given and the love I had for my family and my faith community. The days that followed my conversation with Father Thomas were a mixture of hope and growing tension. I tried my best to hold on to the delicate balance between my newfound spiritual revelations and the life I had once known, but it wasn't easy. Every sermon I gave seemed to carry more weight, each word feeling like a challenge to everything my congregation had once believed. I began to question if I was truly ready for the kind of transformation that awaited me. As I walked through the quiet streets of Wolverton, I noticed the growing distance between me and the people I used to know so well. Conversations became brief, strained. The once warm greetings from my parishioners now felt like they were laced with hesitation. Even the children I had watched grow up seemed to look at me differently, some with curiosity, others with uncertainty. It all came to a head one Sunday after Mass. I had just finished delivering my homily, a gentle reminder of the boundless love of God and the way He calls us to expand our hearts and minds, to love beyond what we understand. As the congregation filed out of the church, a man named Roy, a longtime member of the parish, approached me, his face set in a grim expression. Father Jonathan, he began, his voice thick with frustration. I don't know what's going on with you, but it's getting harder and harder to hear you preach. The things you're saying, they don't match the gospel. You're not speaking about the God we know anymore. I had known Roy for years, a good man who had always been a solid part of our parish. His disillusionment hit harder than I anticipated. Roy, I said gently, I'm speaking the truth I've been given. It's the same God, the same love, just revealed in a way I never imagined before. He shook his head. No, it's not the same. You've drifted away, and people are starting to notice. They're confused, Jonathan. They're not sure what to believe anymore. I tried to hold back my emotions, but his words hit too close to home. I could feel the sting of his judgment deep in my chest. This was no longer just about my personal journey. It was about the community that had been the foundation of my life. Could they ever accept this new truth? Could I? As the weeks went by, I became more aware of the ripple effect my journey was having. People began to pull away from me, not with overt anger, but with a quiet withdrawal. The families I had blessed, the weddings and baptisms I had officiated, all seemed distant now. It felt as though the walls I had once worked so hard to build had started to crumble. The isolation grew unbearable at times. I would sit in the empty church, staring at the altar, wrestling with the profound loneliness that had become a constant companion. There were moments when I wished I could take back the truth I had found, moments when I longed for the comfort of the familiar, the simplicity of the faith I had once preached. But I knew I couldn't go back. The truth was a fire in my soul, and to ignore it would be to deny the very core of who I had become. One evening, while praying in the church, I felt an overwhelming sense of divine presence, as if the Holy Spirit itself were enveloping me in a warm embrace. In that moment, I knew that I wasn't alone. God had not abandoned me. But what came next was something I hadn't expected. Suddenly, I felt an undeniable pull, an invitation to take my journey further. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and I could see beyond the physical world, beyond the confines of this earthly reality. I had experienced glimpses of this before during my near-death experience, but now it was clearer, more vivid. In this moment of heightened awareness, I realized there was more I had yet to uncover. I was being called to something deeper. As I sat there in the stillness, I could sense a profound connection to the divine, an invitation to go beyond my own understanding. I could feel Jesus, not as a distant figure in a book, but as a living presence, inviting me to share in his own transformation, to help guide others through their own spiritual awakenings. The experience left me trembling. I had always believed that faith was something you worked for, something you could teach others through words and actions. But now I was beginning to understand that faith wasn't just about teachings. It was a living, breathing force that shaped and reshaped itself in the hearts of those who sought it. It was fluid, ever-changing, always leading you closer to the truth. I knew then that my journey wasn't about me at all. It was about helping others see the truth for themselves. My role was no longer to be a teacher, but a guide, someone who walked alongside others in their own search for meaning, truth, and spiritual awakening. This realization didn't make the path easier. It only deepened the tension within me. If I embraced this new calling, I would have to leave behind everything I had known. The comfortable role of priest, the certainty of religious tradition, the security of community, everything would have to shift. But something inside me had changed. I had seen a glimpse of the truth, and I couldn't ignore it. No matter the cost, I had to continue on this journey. I had to trust that, in the end, God would provide the way. As the weeks passed, the emotional and spiritual weight of my journey began to take on new dimensions. What I had initially believed to be a solitary path of awakening was slowly revealing itself as something that had ripple effects far beyond myself. I had known that my beliefs would challenge my relationships, but I hadn't fully grasped how deeply it would affect those closest to me. Margaret, ever my support, continued to walk beside me, though with an increasing sense of concern. She could see the toll it was taking on me, on us. We had once been so sure of our place in this small town, with our roles clearly defined. But now, even at home, things felt different. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table, I could feel the tension in the air, thick with unspoken words. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "Jonathan, I can't keep pretending everything is okay," she said softly. "I know this journey is important to you, but it's pulling us in different directions. I don't know where we're going anymore." Her words pierced me like a knife. I had always believed that our bond was unbreakable, that our shared faith and love would see us through anything. But now, I could feel the growing distance between us, the strain of my spiritual awakening pushing us apart. I had never intended for this to happen. I wanted to share this truth with her, with everyone, but the cost was so much higher than I had imagined. "I don't know how to make it better," I confessed, my voice trembling. "I feel like I'm losing you, Margaret. I feel like I'm losing everything." Her eyes softened with sorrow. "Jonathan, it's not about losing me. It's about losing the connection we used to have, the life we built together. You're changing, and I understand why. But I don't know if I can change with you. I'm afraid we're not the same people anymore." The weight of her words settled in my chest, suffocating me. I could hear the pain in her voice, the sense of being left behind. But what could I do? How could I deny the path I was on, the truth that had been revealed to me? That night, I sat alone in my study, staring at the Bible again. The words seemed to mock me now. I had once clung to them for answers, but now they felt distant, foreign. Had I misunderstood? Was I truly following the right path? Was I abandoning everything that had once mattered? In the midst of my turmoil, Father Thomas reached out again, offering a listening ear. I didn't hesitate to meet him. He had become a source of grounding in the storm I was facing. "I'm losing everything, Thomas," I confessed when we sat down in his office. "My family, my community, everything I thought I was meant to be is slipping through my fingers. What if I'm wrong? What if this truth isn't meant to be shared? What if it's just my own delusion?" Father Thomas listened quietly, his expression calm but understanding. "Jonathan, you've been given a profound revelation, but the path you walk now will require patience, love, and humility. People will resist change, especially when it challenges their deeply held beliefs. But that doesn't mean the truth you've received is any less valid. It just means that it's not easy. You must hold on to your calling with compassion for those around you." I nodded, absorbing his words. But still, the question gnawed at me. Could I truly hold on to this truth while still loving the people I had known all my life? As if to answer my question, an unexpected encounter occurred soon after. I had been invited to visit a neighboring town to lead a small service for a family in mourning. The mother, a woman I had known for years, had lost her son tragically in a car accident. The grief in her eyes was raw, her pain palpable. During the service, as I spoke the words of comfort, something inside me shifted. I felt a profound connection to the suffering of the family, but also to something beyond this world, something that transcended our earthly existence. It was as if I was seeing the truth in a new light, understanding how love and pain could coexist, how the divine could reach into the darkest places and bring light. As the family gathered after the service, the mother approached me. "Father Jonathan," she said softly, "I can see something in your eyes. I've heard the way you've been speaking lately, and I can tell that you've been through something. But it's different, isn't it? What you're sharing, it's not just words anymore. You've seen something. I can feel it." Her words stopped me in my tracks. I had been so focused on the turmoil within me, the rejection from my own community, that I hadn't considered the impact my journey might have on others. There were still people out there who needed what I had to share. I wasn't alone in my search for meaning. I said quietly, my voice catching. But it's not easy. It's not something I can explain to everyone." She nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I don't need to understand it, Father. I just know that there's truth in what you're saying. And I believe that somehow it's meant to help others. Me, my family, all of us." Her words were a balm to my wounded heart. In that moment, I realized that my journey wasn't just about my personal transformation. It was about sharing the truth with others, even when it was hard, even when it meant facing rejection. I could be a guide, not by forcing others to see things my way, but by being a living testament to the power of transformation. The tension within me had been building for months, but nothing could have prepared me for the choice that lay before me. It had all come to a head during a seemingly ordinary Sunday service. After the Mass, as the congregation began to leave, I noticed a group of familiar faces lingering near the back of the church. They were members of my parish who had begun to express concern about my teachings, people who had been quiet but whose growing discomfort was now palpable. Among them stood Roy, the same man who had once confronted me after a sermon. His face was tight with frustration, his eyes searching mine for answers. He wasn't alone. A few other parishioners, people I had known for years, stood with him, each of them casting their gaze toward me with varying degrees of doubt, uncertainty, and quiet rebellion. "Father Jonathan," Roy began, his voice firm, "we've been talking, and we're not sure where you're taking us anymore. Your sermons, your teachings, they don't reflect the faith we were raised on. We don't know if we can continue following you like this." His words were sharp, but it was the look on the faces of the others that cut deepest. They weren't angry, not in the way I had expected, but their eyes reflected something much harder to confront: disappointment. "I can't pretend anymore that everything is as it was," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "The truth I've discovered, what Jesus showed me, it's too powerful to ignore. It's changed everything. But I didn't come here to tear apart the community I love. I came to lead you all to a deeper understanding, a truer understanding of God." Roy stepped forward. "You don't get it, Jonathan. You've crossed a line. We can't just throw everything away. The tradition, the faith we grew up with, it's been here for generations, and now you're telling us it's all wrong? That everything we believed is just some kind of lie?" His words felt like a punch to the gut, each syllable a weight in my chest. I could see the hurt in their eyes, the confusion and the fear. Fear of losing everything they had known, just as I had feared losing my old faith when this journey first began. "You think I want to tear down what's sacred?" I asked, my voice cracking with emotion. "I don't. I want you to see the truth that's always been there beneath the surface. This isn't about destroying your beliefs, it's about expanding them. It's about embracing a deeper, fuller understanding of who God truly is." But the silence that followed my words felt like a wall. I could see in their faces that my words no longer had the same power. The trust they had once placed in me as their priest was slipping away, replaced by doubt and fear. "Father Jonathan," Roy said, his voice softer now, but no less firm, "we can't follow you down this road. It's not what we signed up for. You've changed, and you're leading us somewhere we don't want to go." And in that moment, I realized the truth. This was no longer just a philosophical or spiritual journey for me. It was a matter of survival for the community I had spent my life serving. I was faced with an impossible choice: stay true to the revelations I had received, the truth I could no longer deny, or return to the safety of the faith I had once preached, knowing that doing so would mean betraying the deeper calling I had felt so strongly. The decision gnawed at me in the days that followed. My heart ached as I walked through the empty streets of Wolverton, contemplating my next move. Margaret had retreated further into herself, her silence speaking volumes. I knew she was afraid of what this new direction meant for our future. But I couldn't walk away from the truth, not after everything I had experienced. But the weight of losing my community, the people I had ministered to, laughed with, cried with, was unbearable. Was I being selfish? Was I willing to sacrifice everything for a truth that no one else seemed ready to accept? I sought solace in prayer, but the answers didn't come as quickly as I had hoped. It was during one of these moments of solitude, late one night, when I felt a deep and powerful stirring within me, something beyond my own thoughts. It was a presence, a voice, not in words, but in feeling. It was as though Jesus himself was standing beside me, reminding me of the reason I had been called to this path. "Jonathan," I felt him say in the silence, "this journey is not about you. It's about those who need to hear the truth. Trust that I am with you, even in your loneliness. Your calling is not to please people. It is to share the truth with them, even when it's hard. You were chosen for this, and you must stand firm in the face of opposition." I was shaken, but something deep inside me calmed. I had been given a glimpse of the road ahead, one filled with challenges, but also with the undeniable assurance that I was not walking it alone. The choice was no longer so complicated. It was a choice between standing firm in the truth or betraying the calling I had received. The moment had come for me to take a stand. The next day, I called a meeting with the elders of the church, asking them to come together one last time to discuss the future of the parish. As they gathered around the table, I knew that this would be a pivotal moment, a turning point that could either solidify my place in the community or drive me further from it. But I had made my decision. "Brothers and sisters," I began, my voice strong but filled with the weight of what I was about to say, "I can no longer lead this congregation as I once did. The truth I have discovered about God, about Jesus, and about our faith has changed me, and I must follow this path even if it means leaving behind the life I knew." There was a moment of stunned silence, then a murmur of disbelief. But as I spoke, I felt a deep peace settle within me. I was doing what I was meant to do, even though it felt like everything was falling apart around me. I had chosen the truth. And though it was the hardest choice I had ever made, I knew it was the right one. The days following my decision felt like an emotional whirlwind. I was no longer just a priest. Now, I was a man standing alone in the face of everything I had once known. The church was divided, and the parishioners I had served with all my heart were now walking away from me. Some left quietly, others with words of anger, betrayal, and confusion. Each exit felt like a personal wound, each farewell a reminder of the life I had left behind. But through it all, I clung to the deep conviction that I had been called to walk this path, no matter the cost. It was a cold Wednesday afternoon when I received a message from Margaret. She asked me to meet her at the old park bench we had visited on those rare afternoons when we could get away from the church. I agreed, though my heart sank as I walked there. I knew the conversation that awaited me. Margaret had always been my rock, my partner in all things, but I sensed that we were now on different sides of a chasm that I couldn't cross alone. When I arrived, I saw her sitting on the bench, her face unreadable. She had always been my source of strength, the person I trusted most in the world, but now her eyes seemed distant, clouded with doubt. As I sat down beside her, the silence between us spoke louder than any words could. The weight of what was happening hung heavily in the air. "I don't know who you are anymore, Jonathan," she finally said, her voice trembling. "You've changed. You've lost your way." Her words stung more than I expected. I had hoped that she would understand, that she would see this journey for what it was, a transformation toward truth, not a betrayal. But instead I saw the same fear in her eyes that I had seen in the faces of my parishioners. Fear of losing everything, fear of the unknown, fear of a truth that threatened to unravel everything she had ever believed. "I haven't lost my way, Margaret," I said, my voice firm but soft. "I've found the truth I've been searching for my entire life. I can't go back to the way things were, not after everything I've seen, everything I've learned." She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "But you're abandoning us. You're abandoning everything we've built, everything we believed in. Don't you care about us? Don't you care about what this is doing to our family, our life?" Her words cut me deeply. I had never intended to cause her pain, to put her in this position. But the truth, as I had learned, doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't make concessions. And as much as I loved her, I knew that I could no longer live in the shadows of old beliefs that no longer held meaning for me. "I do care, Margaret," I replied softly. "I care more than you'll ever know, but the truth is calling me, and I can't ignore it any longer. It's not about abandoning our family. It's about finding a deeper connection to God, one that transcends everything we thought we knew." She looked away, and I could see her internal battle. Her heart was torn, just as mine had been in the beginning, but I could feel the rift between us widening, a gap that could no longer be bridged by mere words. "I don't know if I can stay with you, Jonathan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can follow you down this path. You're changing in ways I can't understand." The pain of her words was overwhelming, but deep down, I knew this was part of the cost. It wasn't just my community that I had to reckon with. It was my very own family, the people I had promised to love and protect. The realization that I might lose Margaret, the one person who had stood by me through everything, hit me harder than anything else. But in that moment, I also knew that I had made a decision. I could not turn back. Not for anyone. "I understand, Margaret," I said, my voice steady. "I wish things were different. I wish you could see what I've seen, but I can't make you understand. All I can do is follow this truth and trust that, somehow, it will lead me where I need to go, even if that means walking alone." She was silent for a long time, her tears soaking her cheeks. And in that silence, I knew there was nothing more I could say. We had reached an impasse. The days that followed were filled with painful solitude. I spent hours in prayer, seeking guidance, but there was no answer that could ease the ache in my heart. The community I had once loved was splintering, and my marriage was hanging by a thread. Every night I lay awake, my mind racing with doubt and uncertainty. Had I made the right choice? Was this journey really leading me to truth, or was I just another man caught in the illusion of self-righteousness? One night, as I sat in my study, lost in thought, I received a call from Roy, the parishioner who had confronted me months earlier. I expected more of the same, more frustration, more questions about my choices. But when I answered, his tone was different. There was something softer, something more understanding in his voice. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Father Jonathan," he began. "And I want you to know, I'm not entirely sure I agree with everything, but I'm willing to listen. I think we've all been too afraid to ask the hard questions, to really dig into what we believe. I don't know what this means for the parish, but I'm willing to take this journey with you, even if it's just one step at a time." Those words hit me like a wave of relief. For the first time in months, I felt like there was hope. Not just for me, but for the truth I had been struggling to share. There was still resistance, yes, but there was also the beginning of something new. A possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, I wasn't alone in this after all. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I had to keep moving forward. The road ahead would be filled with more pain, more rejection, but also, I hoped, more understanding, more clarity, and perhaps in time, more people willing to walk this road with me. The days turned into weeks, and the pain I had felt in the beginning began to morph into something else, something deeper, more profound. I wasn't sure if it was peace or just exhaustion, but I had come to terms with the reality of my journey. I had lost much, yes, but in that loss I had gained something far greater, a connection to a truth that I couldn't deny, no matter the cost. Margaret had moved out. The weight of that final goodbye still hung heavy in my chest, but I understood her decision. She couldn't follow me into this new life, not yet, maybe not ever. And as much as I hated it, I knew I had to respect that. Our paths had diverged, but that didn't mean we would never cross again. There was no bitterness in my heart toward her, just a deep sorrow that we couldn't walk together anymore. But amidst all the heartache, there were small signs of hope. Roy, the parishioner who had reached out to me, came by often. He would bring his questions, his doubts, but also his willingness to listen. Each conversation with him was like a tiny seed planted in fertile soil, a seed that might one day grow into something beautiful. We discussed the things I had learned, and though he didn't always understand, he listened with an open heart, and that, to me, was a victory. As for the parish, I wasn't sure what would become of it. The church was still divided, but there were a few people who had stayed with me, people who had come to realize that the way we had been practicing our faith wasn't the whole truth. I wasn't teaching them a new religion. I was showing them a deeper, more intimate connection with God, one that didn't rely on rituals and doctrines alone. It was a connection that transcended the walls of the church, a relationship that existed in the heart. One evening, as I sat in my office reading scripture and reflecting on my journey, there was a knock on the door. I looked up to see Roy standing in the doorway, holding a book in his hands. "I think you'll want to see this," he said, his voice full of quiet excitement. I stood up, curious, as he walked in and handed me the book. It was a collection of spiritual writings, but what struck me most was the title, "The Truth That Sets You Free." "This just arrived in the mail," he explained. "I don't know who sent it, but I thought you might find it helpful. There's something about it that feels important." I opened the book, and as I flipped through the pages, my heart began to race. The words on the pages seemed to echo everything I had come to understand, everything I had learned through my near-death experience and the revelations that followed. It was as if someone had written down the truths that I had been struggling to express for so long. The book spoke of a deeper relationship with God, one that didn't rely on religious dogma, but on the direct experience of the divine. It talked about salvation, not as a matter of following rules, but as a matter of embracing the love and grace of God unconditionally. It spoke of the importance of inner transformation, of letting go of old beliefs and opening oneself to the truth that is always available to us. As I read, I felt a surge of joy and relief. This was it. This was the truth I had been searching for, the truth that had been revealed to me in my near-death experience. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to bring this book to me at just the right moment. I looked up at Roy, who was watching me with a knowing expression. "This is the truth, Roy," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "This is the truth that I've been trying to share with others. This is the message that will set us free." Roy nodded, his face lighting up with understanding. "I think you're right, Father Jonathan. This is the way forward. We don't need to keep clinging to old ways. The truth is out there, and it's up to us to embrace it." That night, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from the absence of conflict, but the kind that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are meant to be. I wasn't sure what the future held for me, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. I knew that the journey I had embarked on was far from over, but I was no longer walking it alone. Roy and a handful of others were now walking with me. We weren't sure where this path would lead, but we were willing to take the next step together, trusting that it would bring us closer to the truth. And as I sat there in the quiet of my office, holding the book that had just found its way into my hands, I realized something. This journey wasn't about me anymore. It was about all of us, about the truth that could heal us, that could set us free from the chains of old beliefs, and that could bring us into a deeper relationship with God. I didn't know how long it would take or what the road ahead would look like, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer afraid of the journey, and I was ready to keep moving forward, no matter where it took me. The morning air was thick with anticipation. As I stood at the edge of the church, I couldn't shake the feeling that today would change everything. I had spent so many sleepless nights wondering if I was on the right path, wrestling with the weight of my choices, but now I knew this was the moment that would define everything that had come before it. The church, once full of my parishioners, now seemed like a hollow shell. It was no longer the sanctuary it had been, but a place of struggle, of brokenness. Yet within me, there was a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I had been waiting for the truth to make its final call on my life. And now, as I prepared to speak once more in front of the congregation, it was no longer about defending my choices or explaining myself. It was about delivering a message, one that I had tried to share for so long, but which had always seemed to fall on deaf ears. The truth was not something that could be explained away by dogma or rituals. It was something that had to be lived, something that had to be embraced by the heart, not the mind. As I walked up to the pulpit, I saw familiar faces in the crowd, many of them filled with skepticism, others with anger, but there was one face I searched for above all others: Margaret. She hadn't spoken to me since our last meeting, but I couldn't help hoping that somehow she might be in the crowd. Maybe she would understand now. Maybe, after everything, she would see that I hadn't abandoned her or the faith we once shared. I longed for her presence, even if only to know that I hadn't lost her completely. I cleared my throat, and the noise in the room slowly quieted down. I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but I knew I had to speak from the heart. I began by telling the congregation the truth I had discovered, the truth that had come to me in the most extraordinary way. I spoke of my near-death experience and how it had shattered the foundations of everything I once believed. I told them of my meeting with Jesus, how he had revealed the falsehoods embedded in the teachings I had dedicated my life to, and how he had shown me the true nature of salvation and grace. As I spoke, I could see the faces in the crowd, some disbelieving, some with tears in their eyes, others turning away in anger. But I couldn't stop. I spoke from my soul, hoping that somehow my words might reach the hearts of those who were still listening. When I finished, there was an eerie silence. No one moved. No one said a word. It felt like the weight of the world was hanging in the balance, and I was the one who had dared to tip it. And then, from the back of the church, I heard a voice. It was Margaret's. She was standing there, her eyes fixed on me, her face a mixture of confusion, fear, and something else, something softer. "You've lost your way, Jonathan," she said, her voice trembling. "You've let your faith be destroyed by a vision, by something that wasn't real." I felt my heart sink, but I didn't look away. I had to stand firm now, no matter what. "I haven't lost my way, Margaret. I've found the truth, the one truth that has always been there, hidden behind the veil of man-made teachings. I can't go back to the way things were, and I can't deny what I've learned." The tension in the room was palpable. I knew that I had lost many of them forever. but I also knew that there was something deeper at play here. I wasn't just confronting my community. I was confronting everything I had once believed about myself, about God, about salvation. And I had come to understand that the only way forward was to embrace the truth, even if it meant walking away from everything I had known. Margaret didn't respond. She simply turned and walked out of the church, her footsteps echoing through the hollow silence. It felt like the final nail in the coffin of everything I had once held dear. But as I stood there looking at the empty door she had just passed through, I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't alone. The room was still silent, but a few people in the congregation began to shift uncomfortably. And then one by one, a few began to stand. Some of them walked out, but others stayed, hesitant, unsure. And it was then that I realized something important. I had planted a seed. Whether or not they accepted it today didn't matter. What mattered was that I had spoken the truth, and for some, that truth had already begun to work its way into their hearts. I had no illusions. This was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, full of trials and rejection, but for the first time in months I felt free. I had chosen the truth, and that was all I needed to keep moving forward. As I reflect on my journey now, I realize that everything I once thought I knew about faith, about God, about salvation, was only a fraction of the truth. The truths I had learned in my near-death experience, directly from Jesus himself, were far deeper and far more profound than anything I had ever imagined. But what I've also come to realize is that this journey isn't just about me. It's about all of us, each one of us searching for a deeper connection with the divine. The road has been long and painful, and I've lost much along the way. But I've gained something far more precious than anything I could have imagined, a deep, unshakable peace. A peace that comes from knowing that I am on the right path, no matter how difficult or lonely it may be. I still don't have all the answers, but I don't need them. The truth has a way of revealing itself in its own time. And in the end, it's not about being right, it's about being faithful to the journey, no matter where it leads. If you've found something in my story that resonates with you, I encourage you to reflect on your own spiritual journey. Don't be afraid to question, to seek, to dig deeper. The truth is out there, waiting for you to discover it. And when you do, it will set you free.